Hey guys, welcome back. And in this video, what we're going to look at now is after looking at the anatomy of the stomach, understanding the sections and the tissue layers and stuff, now we're going to look at the physiology, which is how the stomach achieves its function, how it helps us digest food. Um, so we talked about the four sections of the stomach, and in each one of those sections, we're going to have these gastric glands. So these are exocrine glands that we find in the mucosa part of the stomach wall. And these are going to release secretions. They're going to add stuff to the lumen or the inside space of the stomach. And these things that it's going to add are stuff like acid, also hydrochloric acid. We're going to have enzymes in there. We'll talk about proenzymes in a bit. We're also going to find a fair bit of mucus in the stomach and some hormones as well. So let's get into it and let's start talking about them. All right, so when we eat our food, of course, it's mixed up in our chewed up, mechanically digested in our mouth, and then it's swallowed and it moves through the esophagus into the stomach. Once it gets into the stomach, those gastric glands that we were talking about that you'll find in the lining of the stomach will secrete all those same things we just talked about: enzymes, acid, mucus, hormones. And this will all mix together in our stomach. And this is going to be a kind of a thick, really, really acidic soup mixture, partially digested food. And we call this soupy liquid chyme. So the chyme is going to be in our stomach, and we're going to have different secretions working on that chyme to help us further break down the food that we eat. So if we have a look at here now, everyone should be able to recognize the lining of the stomach. We've got our mucosa in this section right here. We get our submucosa, which is the connective tissue that connects the mucosa to the three layers of muscle in the stomach. Don't forget, oblique, circular, and longitudinal. So this here is all muscularis. And finally, we get to the serosa on the outside. So if we look at these little openings that we see in the mucosa, this is what we call a gastric gland. And if we have a closer look at the gastric gland over here, you can see that it's a blind pit. So it goes down and there's an ending to the gland. And then we can notice that there's different types of cells as we look down on the outside of the gland. All right, so here's a closer look at our gastric gland. And in the gastric gland, we're going to have three types of cells that have an exocrine function. Now remember, when we're talking about exocrine, we're talking about glands or cells in the glands that produce products that are released directly into a pit, in this case, or a duct, and that duct will carry it to where it needs to go. So in our case here, our parietal cells, our chief cells, and our mucus cells, they're exocrine cells that are going to produce something, and then that something is going to be carried through the gastric gland into the lumen or the empty space inside the stomach. So let's have a look at those cells. On top of those top three cells, the mucus, the parietal, and the chief cells, we also have two types of cells that are endocrine. Remember, endocrine cells are going to release their products into the bloodstream or the surrounding tissue fluid, and those products are going to be carried to an effector cell somewhere apart from the cells where they're produced. These endocrine cells, they're mostly found in the gastric glands that we find in the pylorus, which is the very lower part of the stomach just before we get into the small intestine. So in this case, we'll be looking at G cells, which secrete a hormone called gastrin, and D cells, which secrete a hormone called somatostatin. So we'll talk about these in a little bit, but let's get back to the exocrine cells. All right, so the secretions from those first three types of cells we talked about, the mucus, parietal, and chief cells, those secretions are going to make up collectively what we call gastric juice. Now this is the stuff that we find in the lumen or the empty space inside the stomach, and this is what helps us further digest the food that we eat. Now our stomach will produce between 2 and 3 liters of gastric juice every day. So if you think about a typical can of soft drink, that's 330 milliliters. Our stomach will produce between 6 and 10 cans of gastric juice every day. So it's quite a bit. Okay, so the first one we talked about, we mentioned, are the parietal cells. Now, the parietal cells are going to be responsible for keeping a low pH in the stomach, okay? They're going to secrete hydrochloric acid, but they're not going to secrete the acid itself. What it does, it secretes hydrogen and chloride ions separately. Now, when these hydrogen and chloride ions travel out through the gastric gland and get into the lumen of the stomach, they combine to form hydrochloric acid, and that's what lowers the pH in the stomach down to around 1.5 to 2. So it's a very low pH, quite acidic. Another thing that the parietal cells will secrete is something called intrinsic factor, and now this is something that's going to help us absorb vitamin B12 across the intestinal lining, but that's something we'll talk about when we get down to the intestine. Now, stomach acidity is quite important. It does a lot of important things, and the four of the major functions of having a very low pH in the stomach is that, first of all, it kills microorganisms. There's no way the food that we eat is sterile, all right? Whenever we eat something, we're going to be ingesting a lot of microorganisms. We're going to be ingesting fungi, we're going to be ingesting bacteria, viruses. So once those microorganisms enter the stomach and they get into that very low pH, there's very few species that can survive that very acid environment. So it kills them quite quickly, and as a result of that, we rarely get sick, or hopefully we don't get too sick when we eat our food. Another thing that low acidity is going to do in the stomach is it's going to denature proteins. So if our food has any enzymes in there that could be negative to us, those will be denatured and they can't cause us a problem. Stomach acid will also help us break down some of the things we eat, the connective tissue, the fatty tissue we find in meat, and then plant cell walls will also get damaged by low acidity, which will help us digest and absorb them. And finally, a low pH is going to help us activate one of the most important enzymes in our stomach, which is called pepsin. Pepsin is a protein digesting enzyme that's produced by the chief cells. So let's talk quickly about how pepsin is produced. So the second type of cells are these chief cells, and what the chief cells secrete is a compound or a product called pepsinogen. Now, pepsinogen is a precursor, or what comes before an active enzyme. Very often we call an inactive enzyme a proenzyme. So if we should always look at words when we're trying to figure them out. Pro in biological terms usually means before. So a proenzyme is an enzyme or a compound before it's an enzyme. So the chief cells secrete this pepsinogen, and when the pepsinogen comes in contact with the hydrochloric acid, it changes and it becomes pepsin. Now, pepsin is the active protein digestion enzyme that we find in our stomach. So if you have meat for lunch, for your dinner, what'll happen is your stomach will have pepsin in there, and then when the meat gets into your stomach, the pepsin will start breaking down those proteins, those polypeptides, and they'll turn them into something that we can absorb, that we can use again. And the optimum pH for pepsin is around 1.5 to 2. So it only works in a very low, a low range as well as a low pH. So here's a look at what just happened in our last two types of cells. We've got our parietal cells and our chief cells. So the parietal cells are going to be the purple ones here. So here's our parietal cells, and then the chief cells are going to be these orange or yellow ones. So the parietal cells are going to secrete intrinsic factor, and like I said, we'll talk about that later. And then they're also going to secrete the hydrogen and the chloride ions. And when those ions get into the lumen of the stomach, they turn into hydrochloric acid, and that's what causes the low pH in the stomach. Now, if we look at our chief cells, they're going to secrete pepsinogen. And pepsinogen is the proenzyme, right? So it's not pepsin, it's not an active enzyme yet, but once this pepsinogen comes into contact with hydrochloric acid, then we get an activated enzyme. And then that pepsin enzyme can work on proteins and turn them into smaller peptides that we can use. Now, you're probably asking, why doesn't the chief cells just secrete pepsin? Well, the reason is relatively simple if we think about the function of pepsin. If these cells were to secrete an active enzyme that can break down proteins, then the first thing that enzyme is going to attack is the proteins in the cell. And if we did that, then what would happen is our chief cells would produce an enzyme that could digest our stomach. So the way that we get around this is we have the pepsin secreted in an inactive form, and it doesn't become active until it gets into the lumen of the stomach, when it can react with the chyme instead of the proteins that make us up and attack us. Now, chief cells are also going to secrete an enzyme called gastric lipase. Now, we talked about a lipase before. We talked about lingual lipase. So you guys know that lipase is an enzyme that's going to break down lipids. So this is the second lipid enzyme that we've seen. And the gastric lipase is going to take short-chain triglycerides, and it's going to turn them into monoglycerides and fatty acids. Now, one thing about the gastric lipase is it works best at a pH of 5 to 6. And since we know that the pH of the stomach is 1.5 to 2, then this enzyme isn't going to work very long in the stomach because it will quickly become denatured. So it breaks down the fatty acids, the triglycerides that it comes into contact with. It works for a short period of time, it becomes denatured, and then we can reabsorb it. And then finally, the third exocrine cell we're talking about now is the mucus cells. Now, these are going to be simple columnar epithelial cells. They're going to be all over the parts of the stomach, not just in the gastric glands. And you've seen pictures of these when you looked and you guys did the histology lab back in biology 1210 or 1501. And what happens here is the epithelial cells of the stomach, the mucus cells, they're going to produce a layer of mucus that's slightly alkaline. So that means it's a little bit basic. And what that mucus does is it coats the inside of the stomach. It surrounds all of the cells that are inside the stomach. You may have heard this called the stomach lining before, but it acts as a protective layer against the inside part of the stomach because the stomach environment is quite hostile. Very low pH hydrochloric acid. It's the same stuff that you find in your car battery. And also we got these enzymes, pepsin, that can go around and break down proteins. Since we're made of proteins, we need to protect ourselves from that. So the two ways that we kind of do that is we have this mucus layer secreted by the mucus cells, and we also have the way that we produce the pepsin and the hydrochloric acid so that it never comes directly into contact with our cells. It's released in a different form, and then it changes form when it's in the lumen. So those are two very smart defense mechanisms that our stomach has. Now, these gastric glands that we're going to find deeper in the stomach, we see them in the pylorus. Remember, so the pylorus is going to be this deep part of the stomach here that connects it to the to the small intestine. We're going to find the last couple of cells that we talked about. We're going to find these G cells, and we're going to find D cells. Now, these are both endocrine cells that are going to produce hormones. Our G cells are going to produce a hormone called gastrin, which is going to stimulate secretion by the parietal cells, so it's going to increase the amount of acid that's in our stomach. And our D cells are going to secrete a hormone called somatostatin, which is going to inhibit the amount of acid, or the gastrin, which increases the amount of hydrochloric acid in our stomach. So these two hormones are going to have contradictory effects or antagonistic effects. The gastrin will increase the secretions by the parietal cells, so it'll increase the amount of hydrochloric acid, it'll reduce the pH in the stomach, and the somatostatin will turn off that gastrin, and as a result it will lower the amount of hydrochloric acid in the stomach, and it'll end up raising the pH of the stomach just slightly. So in our stomach, there's 3 stages of secretion for gastric. So, the gastrin is secreted, it increases the amount of hydrochloric acid in the stomach. So it gets us ready for digestion. So we have the cephalic, the gastric, and the intestinal stages. The cephalic refers to when you're getting ready to eat. So the sight or smell of food, that's going to cause gastrin secretion to go up. It gets your stomach ready for digestion. Once you swallow food and food enters your stomach, then gastrin is going to increase, of course, so it can deal with the food that's there. And then third stage of gastric secretion is intestinal, and the gastrin keeps being secreted for about an hour after you've eaten food.